a citizen of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, who is an award-winning Native American journalist who founded Native News Online in February 2011. Since then, Native News Online, with over 7 million readers who read annually, has become one of the most read daily Native American publications in the country. In October 2020, he co-founded Tribal Business News. Since the beginning of Native News Online, Mr. Rickert has covered stories on dozens of Indian reservations, White House Tribal Nations conferences, and congressional hearings in Washington, D.C., and events throughout Indian country. He also serves on the advisory board of the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association. While an author with essays in 3 different books, his first book, Vision of a Better Indian Country, One Potawatomi Editor's Opinions, was published by Indian Country Media in April 2022. Mr. Rickert also co-hosts the Hope Plus Healing podcast in conjunction with the National Indian Health Board. He is a resident of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we are so grateful that he made his way to Portage this morning to share his message with us. Welcome, Mr. Rickert.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here this morning. The drive down from Grand Rapids was, well, it was beautiful. Snow was beautiful. I got off the highway, and you guys need to do a better job of doing road management down here. All kidding aside, I'm happy to be here. I am, as Kim mentioned, Levi Rickert. I'm a citizen of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. Now, there's a little town near here called White Pigeon, and I am a descendant of Chief White Pigeon. In Potawatomi is Wamimi, and Wamimi was he was a leader back in. He signed the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. He fought along Tecumseh in the Ohio Valley, and by the time he passed away, he actually had come to the notion that in order for the Native people to survive here, and we are on Potawatomi land, as somebody mentioned it earlier, ancestral land, we need to coexist. And he made a pact that with the white settlers down by White Pigeon that he would not let the Native cousins attack them. And he heard that they were going to attack the village there where White Pigeon is now. And the legend is that he ran 150 miles or thereabouts from Detroit to let them know, and that's why they named the town after him. So I'm a proud descendant of Wamimi. So today, I want to talk to you about something that's very in the media, but it's very critical that we are having this discussion now. It's about Indian boarding schools. Now, in the congregants that are present, how many of you ever heard of the Indian boarding school? So you guys are doing a lot better than we were like 3 years ago. I would go into college campuses and hardly anyone would raise their hand. Sometimes maybe, oh, I grew up near the one by Mount Pleasant that's been closed down for a long time. But in 2021, Memorial Day weekend, the world became aware of Indian boarding schools because it was revealed that 215 unmarked graves were discovered up by Camp Loops, industrial or Indian boarding, residential. See, in Canada, they're called residential. I want to be clear about that. Residential schools. School up in Camp Loops. 215 unmarked graves. And since then, Native News Online, we have published about 165 stories about Indian boarding schools. Mainstream media has come in, and I like to say this about mainstream media, and I will plug for who I am or what we are at Native News Online. The mainstream media loves to cover shiny objects. There's so much news on any course of any time. Every once in a while, maybe Christmas week, it's a little slow, but there's always news happening. And the Indian boarding schools, the residential school up in Camp Loops, British Columbia, caught the world's attention. 3 weeks later, Deb Haaland, who is the first American Indian ever to serve in a presidential cabinet in a secretarial role. She's Laguna Pueblo. She's Secretary of the Interior. So 3 weeks later, at the National Congress of American Indians, Secretary Haaland formed and established the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And it was 1 year, actually it was 9 months. The charge was to come up with, identify the boarding schools here in the United States, find out if there are any graves, and on May 11th of this past year, 2022, the initiative investigative report was released. And at that time, the Assistant Secretary for the Interior, Brian Newland, who is a friend, he actually was the former chairperson up at Bay Mills Indian Community up in Upper Peninsula, right by Sault Ste. Marie, but Bay Mills. And he was the tribal chairman there prior to becoming the Assistant Secretary. But Assistant Secretary Newland said, there has not been one family, Native American family, has not been negatively impacted by Indian boarding schools. And to me, that's critical. Critical because my own family, my grandmother, maternal grandmother, Ellen White Pigeon, well, she was Ellen Moore at the time, but Ellen White Pigeon was taken from her reservation in Mayetta, Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, to Genoa, Nebraska. I visited that school last year, and it was actually like a kind of part of my life's journey. I had never, ever visited that school before. But I actually wanted to walk where my grandmother walked. And why is that important? Because I remember looking, and I was with some brothers and I think some cousins at my grandmother's coffin when she died in 1995 at the age of 89. And we looked down and she had this tattoo on her wrist from the Indian boarding schools. Now, Grandma never really talked about what happened there. But I'm going to tell you, Secretary Haaland's initiative is once more opening the eyes for the nation, particularly for Native Americans, to really look at what happened. Now, I'm proud to say that Native News Online has attended every boarding school rally, listening session that the Department of Interior has held thus far. There have been 5. We have been at every single one. And why that's important is we, as it relates to, I mentioned how the national media, mainstream media, covers the shiny object. Native News Online will stay on this case. We'll stay on other stories, other articles that are so important, all the issues important to Native Americans today. We will stay on it because that's who we are. And it's kind of the of and for the people. But I will say this, that many of our readers are non-Native. We purposely write for non-Natives so that they have a better understanding of who we are and why we think the way we do. Now, every Sunday I write an editorial. It's published in Native News Online, and I like to tell people, and Kim mentioned the book, my opinions, I like to tell people, you may not agree with me when you get done reading it, but at least you will see how I logically think the way I do, or why I think the way I do. In Native Americans, I will say this, we have different worldviews. And I love the song about the circle not having an end, Because if you know anything about Native culture, we are circular people. We think in the circle of life, and just the continuation, and it's a beautiful thing. But Native News Online has gone to every single boarding school. I've gone to four. My brother passed away in October, so I was not able to make the one in South Dakota. But there's a common theme. And I'll tell you what happens. Secretary Holland is there, Assistant Secretary Newland is there, and they listen for hours, literally hours. The one up in Pelson, Michigan. That was close to where the Harbor Springs Indian Boarding School was, Holy Child. Closed in 1984. They were there from I think it was 10 in the morning to about 7 o'clock at night, listening to testimony after testimony of people. And this is something that's moved me as a person. This is something that's moved me as a Potawatomi man. I listen to elders come to the microphone, and many of them weep, telling the stories of things, the atrocities that have happened to them decades ago. I remember being in Anadarko, Oklahoma last summer, listening to an 84-year-old gentleman talk about being sodomized repeatedly by priests at an Indian boarding school. Just recently, 2 months ago, I was in Mini Farms. I didn't know there's a Mini Farms, Arizona, but there is. It's on the Navajo Nation. But they had a woman who drove 8 hours down to be able to give her testimony. She shook so much, her niece came up and held the mic so that she could continue talking. She was weeping, talking about being physically, emotionally, sexually abused at Indian boarding schools. And as I recall, she was 64 years old. So I heard these things, and I come home. I can remember it takes about 2 days to kind of process this. I remember last year in Oklahoma, it was just so gripping. The stories were so powerful, so painful. I remember coming home, and I had heard the testimony on Saturday. It wasn't until Tuesday I actually felt like halfway normal again. And for the Secretary of the Interior, Assistant Secretary to hold these things is very critical. Now, they call this the Road to Healing Tour. That clock's not working. Or is it? Okay. Let me know when I'm, because I can go all day. The Indian boarding school, and I told this to Kim earlier today, I'm trying to fit in here in 15 or 20 minutes some of the things that have happened with Indian boarding schools. Really, you could teach a course on it, 12-week course at a university. Because the history goes back over 100 years, but the pain still exists today. There's a woman in Oklahoma who said she has gone through every single counseling, and each year the government, and I like to say this, and I say a little humor, but it's not really funny. The federal government really has never known what to do with Native Americans. True story. Not to get too far off subject, the Navajo Nation tomorrow will argue before the Supreme Court of the United States for some water. Water is life. That was the mantra in Standing Rock. Water is life. Minnie McConey, water is life. Life, we know, sustains us all. But the Navajo Nation they're defending or trying to argue on behalf of citing the 1849 and 1868 treaty that said we want to have water. 30% of the Navajo Nation, 30%, let's call it a third. Third of the people on the Navajo Nation do not have running water. What do? They have to have people deliver, especially the elders, multiple 5-gallon plastic tubs of water so they can wash themselves. And I like to say this, that the Navajo Nation during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, had some of the highest rates. At one point, it was like the epicenter of the world in terms of cases of COVID-19. Native Americans nationwide, 2 and 3 times likelihood to die from COVID. People on Navajo Nation were told, as we were always told by the CDC, wash your hands for 20 seconds. Well, if you don't have water, you don't have 20 seconds worth of water to wash your hands. So tomorrow they're going to argue this before the Supreme Court. And I said that to say that the United States government appears never to know really what to do with Native Americans. That's why I'm happy Deb Haaland is the Secretary of the Interior. She has this road to healing going on. Now we know that healing is a lifelong process. Some of us still deal with scars of things that happened to us when we were children. Not just Native Americans, I know that. There are a lot of non-Native, Caucasian people, Black people, Puerto Ricans, on, who are in years and years of counseling for healing the hurts that have happened to them when they were children. The disclosure of the 215 unmarked graves, as I said, woke up the world. But also to me was more like a scab was pulled back. The wounds are there. I know personally, I had, when you grew up Native American, I knew about Indian boarding schools. I know that in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, outside the one that was there, goes down in 1931. There are approximately 220 graves there of these kids. Now, I'm gonna back up a little bit. I put myself, I'm a father of 3 children. They're growing. But I try to, even before this Camp Loops was announced, and I would talk on university campuses, even before Native News, I would talk about Indian boarding schools, because it's been part of who we are. And I would ask college students, and sometimes now it appears to me a lot of the universities have, their students are a little older, right? So how many of you have children? It was one, I can remember a woman raised her hand. She had a daughter, I think it was 8 years old, and a son 4. I said, can you imagine? Late August, early September, somebody showing up at your door and say, we're taking your children away. Why? Because they have to be educated. They have to be assimilated. Now that's not probably what they were told. We're going to assimilate you, but that was the purpose. Cut off the hair, get rid of the language, and we're going to make them all like everyone else. We're going to Americanize these children. That was really the point. And that's why, for the title of what I talked about today was, and I borrowed from Genesis 50, verse 20, where Joseph told his brothers, who had many years before had sold him into slavery, but he had gone on, become a prime minister, some real high-ranking person in Egypt. He said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. But I want to play around with the phraseology a little bit and switch it, that the U.S. government meant taking children, Indian children, out of their homes, their family homes. They meant it for good. They thought, well, we'll make them all just like us. But when you start hearing about all the evil, as I've heard, as Secretary Haaland has heard, Assistant Secretary Newland has heard, the evil things that happen to us, it's not a wonder. our population, our youth still experience the worst suicide rate any people in the world. I kid you not. Highest suicide rate. And our health disparities are horrible. That's why Native News Online has taken it upon ourselves. We're the only Native American publication in the country that has a health desk, a national health desk. We work with the National Indian Health Board. Very proud of these things. But it's because my people, when I say that with kindness, my people, Native Americans are hurting. Even with the so-called prosperity of Indian gaming, I still see high rates of alcoholism. And so, I'm going to tell you one more story that is so poignant that it just came to me. I need to tell you. How many of you have ever heard of who Dennis Banks is or was? He was the founder of the American Indian Movement, co-founder. He told me this story. I interviewed him years ago at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, and he told me the story about how he was taken to Indian boarding school, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And he tried to run away over half a dozen times at least. And he said that they would have a mail call, right? You could come out and maybe you get letters from your parents. So he said he would go there and never got any letters. No correspondence from his mother. And he said, so he just stopped going to mail call. He ran away, and then they bring him back. One time he actually made it all the way home when he became a teenager. Because he was there for like 8 to 10 years, something. It was like a long time. Finally got home to Leech Lake, where his mother was. And he said the first day was very cold. He was like really resentful. She never wrote him. He felt as if she did not love him. And I guess I'll ad lib here. Most of our relationships are built on interpersonal relationships. It's kind of hard to develop a relationship with your mother, even though she's your biological mother. If you are taken away, 8 years you don't see her, 10 years you don't see her, it's kind of hard to come back and think everything's great. So he said the first day was really he resented her. He said the next day she made him a blueberry pie. Because he smiled when he told me this. He said, she remembered, I like blueberry pies. A little kid, he liked blueberry pie. So check out what happened. Years later, he goes on, he becomes the co-founder of the American Indian Movement, took over Wounded Knee, took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in DC, and made a name for himself. Here comes the internet. So he's online one night. Do you want to hook up or connect with your high school friend? Said no. He said something came up. Do you want to find your Indian boarding school records? Oh yeah. So it was a process. So what? 4 to 6 weeks later, after saying yes, I want to, he received 14 letters in a box from his mother that were never given to him. Think about that. Inside of one of those boxes, or envelopes, was a money order to the school for bus money. Please send Dennis home this summer. He said to me that he said he loved his mother in his adulthood, but he was indifferent to her And remember what I said earlier about the interpersonal relationships, how you have to have that bond. He never really had that bond. He said he took a lawn chair to her grave. He read those letters again and just wept. He was a grown man. This was a fierce leader, one of the biggest warriors we've had in 100 years, Dennis Banks, at his mother's grave weeping because all of a sudden he felt like my mother did love me. And I say this today to this congregation. And we know this. One of the tenets of Christianity is love. I heard it earlier today. Love. So when it comes to Indian boarding schools, I didn't come here to make you feel guilty. But I really am happy anytime a non-native group wants to hear from me to educate themselves as to why we are the way we are. And I just say this, I'll leave you with this. Know this, we as a people, meaning the Native Americans, Indian country, there's still a whole lot of healing that has to take place. And as Brian Newland said, as a result of the Indian boarding schools. So, in your Christian prayers, however you want to do it, pray for us. Pray that, and I guess this month is Reparations Month. That's great. There's a whole lot of healing that needs to take place in this world. It's not just for Native Americans, I know that. But I'm kind of like I'll say it with a smile on my face, be an ambassador for my people through Native News Online. That's what it's all about. So thank you very much. Chi Miigwech for listening to me.